we started looking at the issue of giving in the 21st century. And as we were in our weekly meditations on giving, we've been trying to understand what giving is so that we can then make some conclusions a few weeks from now on how we ought to approach giving in this new era of time that we live in. And so I've been going over the Old Testament over the last 6 weeks, and we've come to the end of our time in the Old Testament. And so I just want to kind of give a summary of what we have learned in our meditations over these last few weeks, and then begin the process of moving us in our weekly meditation on giving into the New Testament. You can go ahead and turn to Matthew chapter 6 if you want, and in preparation, I'm going to eventually get there. But let me kind of summarize what we've seen so far through our study of the Old Testament. What we've seen is that the pattern of giving to the Lord that was taught prior to the law and after the institution of the law was what we refer to as free will giving. The tithe was not giving to the Lord in the New Testament sense of the word, but rather it was the paying of one's taxes. In other words, the failure to give to God the free will type of offering was the evidence of spiritual insensitivity, while the failure to give to God the tithe was evidence of stealing from God. Why? One was a required tax, that is the tithe, while the other was an expression of a heart spiritually tuned to God. And so that's why when we look at the New Testament, sometimes I'm asked, well, why doesn't the New Testament mention tithing as the means by which we give to God? Well, the reason the New Testament doesn't do that is because the tithe was a tax. Because the church is not a nation in the same way that Israel was and is a nation, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a difference. Israel was and is a nation in both a physical and a spiritual sense, while the church is a nation in a spiritual sense. That being the case, it's quite natural for Jesus and ultimately the church that he established to separate the giving required of the physical and spiritual nation of Israel in their application of it to the church. For example, when the Bible talks about taxes, what does it say in the New Testament? We pay our taxes to our government, right? Jesus paid taxes, Matthew 17, 24 through 27. Jesus commanded the payment of one's taxes, Luke 20, 19 through 26. And Paul himself also directed believers to pay their taxes, Romans 13, 5 through 7. The New Testament saint mimics the Old Testament saint in their paying of the tithe by paying their taxes to their government. And we mimic the Old Testament saint in our giving by giving to God free will wise in our weekly giving to God. So that's the Old Testament. That's kind of in a summary. We've been meditating on this for now 6 weeks, month and a half, and so that kind of summarizes all that we have learned. So now we come to the New Testament. Beginning with the Gospel of Matthew, it becomes clear that Jesus had a very specific understanding of giving and how we as God's children ought to give to him. There are two principles that really begin the New Testament when it comes to giving. Keep these in your mind. Giving that Jesus recognizes is both spiritual, and it's secret. It's spiritual and it's secret. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Look what Jesus says here, verses 1 through 4. He says, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have your reward with your Father who is in heaven. When therefore you give alms, do not sound a trumpet before you as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. But when you give alms, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, that your alms may be in secret, and your Father who sees in secret will repay you." From this passage, the believer learns that giving is a spiritual discipline of the Christian life. In other words, it's an expression of the spiritual integrity and the spiritual maturity of the believer. Well, this is due to the fact that Jesus labels it. Notice, he labels giving as a practice of righteousness. It's a practice of righteousness. The only rightful evaluator of righteousness is God. I can't evaluate your righteousness except by what the Word says. I don't have a standard of righteousness for myself. I have to go to the Word of God. And so when it comes to giving, where do we get our principles from? It's not from what I say. Okay? It has to be from the Word of God, because the Word of God is the standard of righteousness. So as we come now out of the Old Testament into the New Testament, we see that giving, number one, is spiritual, giving, number two, is secret, and it's evaluated as such by God. God sees our heart when we give. He knows whether we're giving generously or not. He knows whether we're giving sacrificially or not. He knows whether we're giving joyfully or not. And those are the things that should mark our giving. It's from our heart. That's where giving begins. As we prepare our hearts to give at this time, let's make sure that we're giving from the heart in worship of our God and not to be seen by others.